Good evening to you all on this absolutely gorgeous day. It's very nice to welcome the light evening. We waited a long time for this. And particularly, of course, welcome to Professor Stephen Whittle, who we're so pleased this evening to speak on this very big set of issues, gender, has it any future? Stephen is Professor of Equalities Law at Manchester Metropolitan University. Age 19, he helped set up the UK's first local transgender support group. Throughout the 70s and 80s, having lost numerous jobs due to his transsexuality, he decided that the status of the transsexual community could only change if its members became lawyers. He qualified in law in 1990 and has since successfully fought out cases at the European Court of Human Rights, the Court of Justice, and the UK's House of Lords. Stephen has been an advisor on these issues to numerous governments, I won't list them, as well as the European Union, the Council of Europe, and the European Commission. He advises lawyers regularly and writes court briefs regularly, and is a frequent and expert witness in courts across the world. In 2005, I find this slightly ironic given the title, as it were, he was made an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, in the Queen's Honours List for his work on transgender rights. Please join with me in giving him a really warm welcome.
I presume this is the technology, as it's been left on the side. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here to Durham, and my wife and I have had the most marvellous 2 days here, and really, gosh, it's so Harry Potter. You know, my eldest daughter, who was desperate to receive a letter to say she was going to go to Warlocks, will just wish Hogwarts, that's it. No, Warlocks is the other place. Hogwarts, she will have been so sorry not to have come up for this trip. Amazing, but it's been wonderful, a wonderful welcome, and we really have had a lovely time. And I say my wife and I, but of course, 10 years ago, she wasn't my wife, even though we'd been together at that point for 26 years. The Gender Recognition Act allowed us finally to get married, and for me to become the father of the children that we'd had together through donor insemination. Well, rather, my wife had had the children. I'd just sat there and smiled and held her hand, primarily. But to be able to become their father, but having had 4 children and raised 4 children, it has posed a whole series of questions about this thing called gender. I remember certainly asking, I'm going to take my jacket off, I feel terribly formal. And I'm much more happy being slightly relaxed. Having raised 4 children, you watch them grow. Certainly remember my son saying to us one day, how do you know the twins, we had twin girls, how do you know the twins are girls? At that point, I sort of got a very hot and cold sweat, thinking this is probably the most important question I've ever been asked in my life by a 4-year-old, and I don't think I know the answer. Fortunately, my wife, who an experienced nurse, so therefore is very good at doing this sort of thing, went, now, Gabriel, we don't know whether the twins are girls. What we do as parents is make a guess. We've worked out that most babies who are born with vaginas will grow up to be girls and then women, and that most babies who are born with penises will grow up to be boys. But as you know from Dad and Christine and Jonathan and all these other people who are our family friends, that's not always the case. So, if we've made a mistake with that guess, one day the twins will tell us, and then we'll sort it out. And he went, okay. And that was it. It must be 12 months ago, he was in his halls of residence, and I actually heard him explaining to somebody else there almost exactly the same words that his mother had told him 14 years earlier. He said, well, it's like this, we make a guess. And I thought, you know, didn't we train him well? But it's actually right, that's all we do, we make a guess. The midwife gets that baby, they hold them up, they go 2.5 centimetres or more, you've got a boy. 2.5 centimetres or less, you've got a girl. 2.5 centimetres, God, you're buggered, you've got an in-between. And that's exactly and precisely how it's done. The actual complexities of the intersex child, for example, take much closer examination, and consequently many people with an intersex condition will not discover until they're much older in life that they have that intersex condition, because the midwife simply does a rough guess. And having watched 4 children, I've always wanted, being born, I've always wanted to say, do you think you ought to do it more scientifically? So I want to talk about gender and has it any future? And that may seem a strange question as somebody who has spent the last 40 years of their life risking everything in order to be my gendered self. What does, you know, why would I be questioning this thing that I have given such value in my own life? Well, because I think actually we take it as read, but it has a very short history, and whether it has a future that we want, I would question. Now we're going to try the technology, so we'll see if it works. Hooray! So, is gender given and fixed? I ask you this series of questions. Is gender about being male or female? Well, no, animals we also categorise as male or female, but we don't categorise them as girls and boys, you know, which is the sort of crux, really. We might say they're dogs and bitches, but we don't think of them as having a gender identity. So clearly it's not biologically related to that notion of being male or female. The gender that you have is something separate from being biological. Is it socially constructed, being a man or a woman? Well, possibly. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Is it something that's entirely culturally defined, how masculine or feminine you are? And again, it's something that's worth looking at slightly more depth. But we do know that the things that have been used for defining gender in the past have been things like whether you've got hormones or chromosomes. Now, anybody here know what their chromosomes are? Even if you're trans, do you know what your chromosomes are? Because I think most of us don't. We never get to know what they are. You know, it's something that it sits in the back of us. Yet for 30-odd years, people's lives in this country and throughout the world still are defined and decided because of their apparent chromosomes. But nobody knows what they are. You know, entirely because of a Court of Appeal decision in 1971, your chromosomes make you. But even at the time in that Court of Appeal case of April Ashley, the model who, in cases Corbett and Corbett, she tried to divorce her husband because he was a swine. He decided to counter-divorce her because she wasn't a real woman. And the court decided because of her chromosomes, she was a man for the purposes of marriage and therefore couldn't have married her husband. So he got the property and he got the money. It always boils down to property and money. That's the nice thing about law. Look for the greed and you'll find the guilty person. Ultimately, though, nobody ever knew what April Ashley's chromosomes were. I know her now, and she says, I've never had them tested. Never. She said, as for my gonads, I no longer had them, so how the court could determine my fate based upon them when, you know, they had never seen them. And as for my hormones by that time, they were well and truly female hormones. You know, so that sort of dictation of people's lives through this notion of biology is incredibly complex and problematic, and whether it actually means anything in relation to gender is another question completely. So that notion of penis and vagina. We've just had the Same-Sex Marriage Act. Now, one of the things that happened with the Same-Sex Marriage Act was earlier than that, several years, nearly almost 9 years earlier, when the Civil Partnership Act was coming into being. There was a question, and that is, how do you deal with adultery or non-consummation? How do you define adultery or non-consummation in a same-sex partnership? I remember these civil servants in this room going, well, surely it'll be whether people have had anal sex. So a little hand went up from the corner and said, lots of gay men don't like anal sex and never do it, and most lesbians have never practiced it. And they go, what other sexual activity can we think of? And ultimately they decided to give up on sexual activity, and one of the reasons why you can't annul your marriage as somebody in a same-sex marriage nowadays using the idea of non-consummation is because civil servants couldn't imagine, had not a good enough imagination to imagine what consummation might be under those circumstances. But the other conversation was about penises and vaginas, and I pointed out to them a while back that actually people with two penises or people with two vaginas, not two vaginas each, but one vagina, you know, each person, were getting married already. You could see this sort of slightly sickly look on people's faces. What do you mean they're getting married already? Overseas? No, 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 no. They're doing it here in England perfectly legally. How? Well, the Gender Recognition Act allows people to be recognised in their new gender without having to have undergone any medical treatment and certainly not any surgery. So yes, lots of people with a vagina each, or lots of couples with a penis each, have got married legitimately in this country. And guess what? The sky's not fallen in. Nothing has happened. In fact, the best thing I can say about same-sex marriages that I would recommend to people is that the experience of trans people was the sun nearly always shone when trans people had their weddings. So, you know, God obviously shone his righteous life, his light upon the righteous, as one put it. Is gender a matter of attribution? Is it when we say to our children, you're my son, you're my daughter? Well, my mum said, you know, I was her daughter, until she sort of finally got round to the idea of saying that she had 3 sons and 2 daughters, and not 3 daughters and 2 sons, which she found a bit of a tongue tie. And is gender a sense of identity, that psychological difference? Now, you know, I put these things down there because throughout the academy, throughout sciences, the natural sciences, biochemistry, psychology, English literature even, the question of who and what gender is has become profoundly important. We spend masses and masses of time. There are hundreds of journals which address the question of how gender affects our lives and, you know, what it fundamentally means for us. Which is okay for us who are doing, those of us who are looking at gender studies, because, you know, it's given us a job for quite a time. But a fundamental issue is that we seem to have be discussing the whole question almost arse about face. It's back to front. When you look at David Beckham, now whether you particularly fancy him or not, somebody will fancy him in the room. Do they fancy him because they know he's got a penis? Of course they don't. They fancy him because he looks like David Beckham. You know, it's not even the money actually when it boils down to it. You know, you look at a person and you fancy them and you find them attractive, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with their body. It's entirely to do with the presentation of themselves, completely. Otherwise, there are many people in this world who would never get together with somebody else. You know, my wife always says there's somebody for everybody, and I look round and think, thank heavens, you know, because there's a lot of people who would never be with anybody otherwise. But the reason we actually fancy people is because we like their gender presentation. Yet we spend years, you know, we still talk about sexual orientation, but it has nothing to do with sex. You know, the sex bit comes after. It's entirely to do with the way they present their gender. Being gendered, as it currently exists, basically can be deadly. A friend of mine in the States who lives in Los Angeles used to say, the thing about being in Los Angeles is if you're black and you're a boy, it's a sort of fatal disease. Because at that time, 1 in 5 black boys were not going to live beyond the age of 24 to 25. Because simply being a boy meant they had a high chance of dying from a gunshot wound. In the UK, 4 out of 5 girls between the ages of 12 and 20 can expect to experience a sexual assault, from the flasher to the very serious rapes and homicide. 4 out of 5, 80%. You take the number of women in this room, take every row, and take 4 of them to one side and say, you're going to be one of those victims because you just happen to be a girl. That's like serious, and yet we don't seem to be doing anything about it. Recent research was doing an asylum case a couple of weeks ago. We had 3 days to prepare evidence, so we gave up sleep. And we tried to find out if it was safe for a transsexual woman who was an asylum seeker to be sent back to Italy. In Italy, if you're transsexual, you can only change your name at the point of having gender recognition by law, complete gender recognition. You can only have gender recognition by law if you've undergone gender reassignment surgery. There's only one clinic in Italy providing the equivalent of National Health Service gender reassignment surgery. The queue is massive. If we have an asylum seeker from Syria or Iraq who's being sent back to Italy from the UK, what chance does she have of making it through the system? Well, the fact is, she can't even change her name. So what is she going to end up doing? She's going to end up working in sex work, which is where most people do end up. And then the chances of dying, being killed by, a client is phenomenally high. In the last 15 years, in the UK, 9 people have been murdered who are transsexual women. In Italy, in 3 days' research on the internet, we found 64 such homicides. And why? Because they have no space in which to be, because their gender can't be recognised. Your male name is going to exist with you until you somehow found a lot of money and got off and got some operation done. In the US, this was just in today's, on the internet today, 1 in 6 black men in the USA is missing. Is actually missing from society. They're either in jail or they're dead, just because they're black and male. So the whole point about his gender is once you assign it with some other feature, it starts to become a deadly combination. On its own, at home, in the family, it can hopefully be a place of expression, a way of choosing to be yourself, of presenting yourself in clothes that you like, with the materials you like, and things like that. But the minute you walk out of the house, as soon as you add something else to it, it becomes problematic. So I work in a university where a lot of our students are of Muslim, Asian ethnicity, and they have come from Muslim families. Many of them come, or are Hindu. All of them come from families where they still live within a caste structure. The number of girls who come to my office in tears because they can't marry the boy they want to marry, because they happen to be a girl and they're Asian and they're from the wrong sort of caste. It's an ongoing problem, as we put it, and has certainly led me to do a lot of work around the area of caste and caste equality. So, the key thing, I think, to remember is that gender is a product of the 1950s imagination. It didn't exist separately from the word sex as such prior to that. It was used interchangeably to mean biological sex phenomena. If you go to Israel, there is no such word as gender, and you don't have gendered words. So I remember going to the temple in Jerusalem with a transsexual woman, and I said, is it all right for me to go down to there, because I'm not a man in English law. He said, oh, it's fine, because the only concern is that you're portraying yourself as a man. You know, if you say you're a man, because it can't be defined any other way in, you know, Hebrew, in Israeli, in the languages that are used in Israel. And I said, what do you call transsexuals then in Israel? She said, oh, we call them cochinelles. And I went, that's the name of a French dancer from the Folies Bergère. And she went, yes. And she came and did a tour of Israel in 1961. And she was so popular that they decided to call transsexuals cochinelles after that. I said, what about the people like me? She said, oh, you lot, well, you don't, I just don't have a name. But gender is very much a product of the 1950s imagination, and the imagination of one particular person, Dr. John Money, who you will see is entitled The Gender Hoax. John Money he calls himself a biological psychologist, whatever one of those is. He used to look at intersex children, and he suggested there was a window of opportunity for surgeons to do corrective surgery on children with intersex conditions, so corrective surgery changing their genitals to look more normal. And that period, that time in which you had that gender gate, was when a child was up to the age of 2. That was about 1954. There were still surgeons doing corrective genitals reconstruction surgery on infants under the age of 2, mostly not in Europe. But there's a clinic in New York where you can take your baby and they'll transform them into some form of normality, if you like, to this day. The thing with John Money, he said, you know, he had this theory, he wrote his couple of papers, and he said, how do we put this theory into practice? At the same time as he was writing about this thing called gender and how it was socially constructed, and how if you took a baby and you changed their gender before the age of 2, they would be happy with it, or if you took them and corrected them into a gender place, they'd be happy. Same time we had people like Simone de Beauvoir writing, saying such things as one is not born a woman but becomes one, and saying really we're nothing more than the constructions of our world. Almost as sort of on par with what John Money was saying within his framework. And ironically, many feminists took and read the work of John Money and said, yes, that's it, we can go and get the sorts of jobs men have. Because after all, women can't be restricted by our biology any longer, we can do anything. John Money wanted to test out his little theory, so he found this child. This child, Brenda Reimer, was actually born of one of 2 boys, twin boys. Underwent a circumcision, well, both boys did, and this little boy's penis was burnt off completely in the circumcision operation. John Money, the parents took the baby to see John Money, having been advised to go there, and he said, we can make your child, we can't ever give him a proper penis, but we can make him into a very happy little girl and grow up into being a woman. Pumped the kid through full of hormones, did things like get the 2 boys to play pretend sex role games, even sexual activity, you know, games as they talk about later in life, and said, you're now called Brenda, you'll be perfectly happy. Brenda, at the age of 12, said to her parents, why do I feel like a boy? And the parents sat down and explained, and Brenda decided to go back to being who she originally was, David, saying, I always knew her as a boy. I always knew her as a boy, even though nobody's ever told me that, but I've always known I was a boy. David went on to undergo genital reconstructive surgery and other surgeries in order to grow up and become David. And, nobody ever knew about this. John Money was still writing about how gender was entirely a social construction, and, you know, we could place it on children as and when we wanted to, when Mickey Diamond from the University of Hawaii started to do studies on twin children and found out some really interesting things about transgender children who were twins. And he said, I've read about this before. somewhere and went off and found the work from John Money and set out to find Brenda Reimer, this little girl who was supposedly happy, and what he found was David. There's a book written about it called John to Joan. There's another book as well that's very good about it. You can find lots of literature on the internet about David Reimer's case. It had quite a lot of publicity. At the age of 27, David's brother committed suicide because of partly the publicity, partly the shame of having been one of these two twins, and 2 weeks later David committed suicide. And I think I had talked to David a couple of times by that point, and I think, you know, these two little boys had somebody decide who they could grow up to be. Probably they didn't mean any harm. John Money was never a man who meant harm. The only harm he did was when he knew that Brenda Reimer at the age of 12 was going back to being David, he never wrote it up. And so surgeons carried on doing intersex conversion surgery on children right through until today in some clinics. And it took another academic to find David and to say, hold on, do we really know anything at all about gender? If this didn't work, and this is what everybody's based their understanding of gender on, a series of articles in which it says that gender is a social construct, you know, perhaps we need to rethink it all. And that's where it comes to the question of trans people, because trans people voluntarily, as grown-ups, go off and have all sorts of operations done and take hormone therapy in order to change their bodies, in order to, they would all say, in order to be themselves. And yet, is that any different from this sort of process of taking an intersex child and operating on the child in order to normalise them? Because after all, if you ask David or you ask Jeanette here what they were trying to do, they'd say, I'm trying to live an ordinary life as me. That's all I want to do, is live an ordinary life as me. And to do that means I've got to make big changes to my body. Well, I actually asked trans people quite a lot the question of, what gender are you? How do you know what gender you are? Who decides what gender we have? You know, how does this all fit together as a series of sums for us? And the other thing I often say to people is, which bit of your gender is being changed? You know, for years it's been known as a sex change, and we've spent years shouting from the rooftops, we're not having our sex changed, because sex is biological, you can't change it. So therefore it must be gender that's being changed. Well, if we're having our gender changed, what is it we're having changed? Is it the gender assignment, the fact that your parents go, oh, it's a girl, I've got a daughter, or, oh, it's a son, a boy, I've got a son? That's the assignment bit? Is it the fact that when other people see you, they go, oh, that's a man, or that's a woman? Is that the bit you're changing? Is it your actual identity yourself? And that's an interesting one, because they all say, I've always had this gender identity. I say, have you changed your gender identity? No, I was always this. I've changed something else, somewhere else, but it's not this. And obviously, the most clearest thing they have changed is their gender role. The role they play in ordinary everyday life, the way they present themselves to other people. That's what you change. No sex changes, no identity changes. You change your role. Now, I did that special effect, as a process of change. I hope you noticed it took me ages to work out how to do that. We'll do it again specially, so you can see it. In case anybody was asleep. Now, don't you think this is artful PowerPoint? Right. When a trans person is transitioning from one gender role to another, the French, and we talked about this over dinner a little bit, the French love to hypothesize theoretically about issues. And there's this great question they have: are we practicing the art of delusion? Are we deluded? Am I deluded when I say I'm a man? Or are we creating an illusion for other people so that they're deluded? So, you know, I do a perfect illusion of a man, and you're the person who's tricked and deluded into thinking that I am a real man. And every now and then, a group of PhD students who I've taken for a curry and given too much beer, you know, they say to me, "So, Stephen, tell me, what are you?" So would you like the one-line version, the several paragraphs, or the Encyclopedia Britannica version of who I am? Because it's complex, and I don't even know if I have the answer to that question. All I do know is that, you know, I'm comfortable with being Stephen. Just as, you know, obviously my family's comfortable with me being Stephen, people I work with are comfortable with me being Stephen. That's who I am. You know, the question of what my gender is or my sex is, I don't know whether I'm, you know, putting on a perfect illusion. I don't practice very hard at it. You know, the hormones obviously helped, but I would never, for example, put things to raise my height in my shoes like some people do. And what is that process of change? There isn't an easy answer. But the very fact that I had to change is in itself problematic, because the process of change was not easy, was not made easy. And certainly in the 1970s, it seemed like a sort of golden chalice at the end of a huge quest to be able to do this thing in order to live as myself. 2 years ago, I went to the 40th reunion from the date I'd left school. So I went to an all-girls school, and I had my arm twisted around my back, and I went to the 40th reunion. I walked in a room full of 58-year-old women. It's a bit of a shock, you know, and then they turned into 17-year-old schoolgirls in less than 5 minutes. You know, the bossy one was bossing us around, the one who organised things was organising everything. They just fell into role immediately. They were completely who they were. I knew exactly who they were, despite the fact that 5 minutes earlier I'd had no idea who they were. Later on, there were photographs, and I said, well, the thing that's really strange about this is, in some ways, after that first 5 minutes, you had never changed, whereas at least I've changed. And the answer was, actually, you've not changed one iota, except that now you smile. And I thought that was a really, you know, it actually probably was. It was the first time I'd gone to school and ever been happy there. And it took until I was 58, you know, to get to be happy at school. But am I practicing an illusion or a delusion? Am I deluded? I may be deluded, I don't know. But either way, as I say to every now and then to a shrink who asks me a similar question, you know, the question of whether I'm deluded or not is irrelevant, because actually 99% of my life I function very well. And the fact that I've become a professor, and the fact that, you know, I've not been sacked from this job, and the fact that, you know, I've raised 4 children with my wife is in itself a sign of mostly a sane person. And this little bit of insanity that attaches to my gender is perhaps not really very important when it boils down to the question. You know, once it was sorted, it was really a little tiny thing that needed to be sorted out. So, the key question that is repeatedly brought to this question of gender then is, can we work out now what gender is? Can we do a science and determine this 1950s concept of the imagination, or the concept of the 1950s imagination? Can we scientifically work it out? I put a picture of Lily Elbe on there specifically because the film, The Danish Girl, is about to come to the cinema any time now. And it's about the life of Lily Elbe, but I'm sure they'll make a total codge-up of it. But the fact is that when they were filming it, they advertised for trans people to take part as extras in the film, not to be trans people in the film. You didn't have to look trans, but because they wanted the community to be able to participate in something that was about the making of their history. And I thought, and this is Touchstone Pictures doing this. That's how big we've got. You know, that is amazing. The idea that we would be considered to be an important part of our own history is in itself amazing. The first person, however, to really recognise that trans people could gain and be treated in any way, shape or form was this sexologist called Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a doctor, specialised in endocrinology, opened up a clinic in Berlin that was closed down by the Nazis. Some of you may know this story. But he was the first person through that clinic to provide what we might call gender reassignment services. And Lily Elbe was probably the third person to be treated there. And the operations were pretty disastrous. They used to take goat testicles, for example, and stick that into people who were born female to make them into men. And they used to take goats' ovaries and stick them into people who were born male to make them into women, and generally people didn't live very long. And thankfully, sometime in the early 1950s, scientists realised you could get hormones better made in the lab than getting them out of goats all the time. And finally, transsexual people started to live. But Magnus Hirschfeld was the first person to say, actually, there is this phenomenon called the transsexual. Not the transvestite, not the person who just cross-dresses, not the homosexual, but a person who, he calls it, neurological gynandromorphs. So in other words, brain gynandromorphs are people who are affiliated to women, particularly, because he primarily saw it in terms of transsexual women, that they were different from physiological hermaphrodites, that it was a separation of a form of intersex condition that was due to the brain rather than an intersex condition just of the body. That was how he determined it. And he described these people as the people who adopted the gender role opposite to their sex by men or women who held an unswerving conviction that they were assigned to an incorrect sex. Now, I'll just stop for a minute at that point. I'm going to ask you to shut your eyes, like I do with all my students, and put up your hands if you have an unswerving conviction that you know what your sex is. And I'll use the term sex first. Okay, put your hands down. Now, do the same thing. If you have an unswerving conviction that you know what your gender is, put up your hand with your eyes shut. It's only about a third each time. That's interesting. Get 2/3 if you aren't certain. You can put your hands down now and open your eyes. The chap over there. Most people actually would say, if I say to them, how do you know you're a man or a woman? They say, oh, I'm not really sure. And my son, who asked all these sorts of questions, we once asked him, do you know whether you're a boy or a girl? And he said, I know I'm a boy. And I said, why do you know you're a boy? And he went, because I've got a penis. And I said, oh, does being a boy, do you feel it through your penis? And he was about 6 at the time, and he went, no. He said, and he went, and he's a musician now, incidentally. He went, no, it's like listening to music. You don't hear it in your ears. It's somewhere up here. And I looked at him and thought, that's really profound. But it's absolutely right. If you listen to music, you don't listen to it here. You listen to it somewhere inside here. And you feel it through the whole body. And he said he knew he was a boy because he felt it up here and could feel it throughout his whole body. He was fairly certain at that point that he knew he was a boy, but most people would say they don't know whether they are or they aren't. This thing is put upon them. They're told they're going to be a son or a daughter, and they sort of live with it for the rest of their lives. Recent survey in the Netherlands of 360,000 people, 2% said they were deeply unhappy with the gender role that they had to perform. I look at students at university and I often think, how happy are you playing this gender that you think you ought to play because you're a student at university, and there's a certain way of being gendered if you're a certain age and a certain, you know, you've been given that label. How many people are truly happy with that sense of gender? Well, clearly many aren't. But we still never know what it is. And one of the things that's happened with trans people since the days of Magnus Hirschfeld is people have increasingly tried to find out what it is that makes trans people do this thing where they say, by the way, I've got an unswerving conviction that I know my gender, and it isn't the one that was labelled to me when I was a child. In 1995, a team in the Netherlands produced this piece of research. There's things in the brain called sex dimorphic nuclei. We all have them. They're different between men's brains and women's brains, and there's lots of them, and they're all over the brain, and sometimes people don't know what they do and what they do. But they discovered, by slicing up the brains of dead people, a dozen of whom were transsexual people who'd given their brains, you know, post-death, I reassure you, that they sliced them up. They discovered this thing called the sex dimorphic nuclei, the BSTC, that actually it was larger in cis men, ordinary men, and trans men, and it was smaller in size in cis women and trans women. And yet, it never changes after birth. After a child is born, it never changes in size. It's stuck from your pre-birth time. So somebody said, oh, well, of course, it's because they've been taking hormones. And they said, guess what? 3 of our group of brains never took hormones. They're identified as women, but they'd never taken hormones, so they could never have been changed through them taking hormones. And yet, they still fell into the pattern. Now, really interesting, on the radio yesterday, Woman's Hour, they were talking about the differences between men's and women's brains. And they talked about the fact that some things are known to be different between men's and women's brains. And then the specialist they had on said, oh, but it's not about men's and women's brains. It's about whether brains are bigger or smaller. That's what makes the difference. We've just realised in the last couple of years that all this sort of work has nothing to do generally between men's and women's brains. It's whether the brain's bigger or smaller. And on average, men have bigger brains and women have, on average, smaller brains. So I'm thinking, I wonder if I've got a really big brain inside this little pinhead on the top of my body. And that's how I've ended up with a bigger BSTC. Or maybe I don't have a bigger BSTC. And if you tested me, you'd discover that I had an ordinary one and that therefore I shouldn't be a transsexual man. Because that's the logic, isn't it, to it, if we produce that form of science. In 2008, a team in Austria said, guess what, we found a gene that makes women feel like men. In fact, what they did was they went and did a gene, DNA sampling of transsexual men and ordinary women, and they found a separate gene that their group of transsexual men had. So I thought, oh, that's easy. Then I can say to my mother, I've got a gene that's made me the way I am, you know. It was nothing to do with you. Well, it was to do with you, because you must have passed on the gene, or my dad did, but it's nothing, it's not your fault. And then they clarify their results and say, but only 44% of the trans men have this gene. No other men have the gene, no other women have the gene. It's only in trans men, but it's only in 44% of them. What if I'm in the 56%? Maybe I'm still not a real trans man. And then, in 2011, we had another set of brain differences. I like the way the New Scientists report these things with pictures alongside it. But they said, guess what? Transsexual people have a different amount of white matter in their brains. If they scan our brains, which they can do to us afterward, when we're still alive, they discover we have more white matter. But of course, if you have more white matter and less grey matter, you tend to be slightly less intellectually able, because the white matter doesn't process neuron pathways quite as well. So I said, oh, maybe that's why I only went to, you know, Manchester Metropolitan University instead of Manchester University. Maybe I was intellectually challenged. But they did this on scans, and then they discovered, of course, actually, it had more to do with size of brain than actual difference. They finally admitted this year that they thought the research that they'd done was probably wrong and had to be revisited, because they still don't know what makes our genders. The final last one I'll look at, there's loads of stuff. We've had stuff on finger lengths, how many uncles you have on your mother's side by marriage. There was other stuff that was about the size of your femur. You know, and apparently they could tell who was transsexual through this until they revisited it and actually realised they couldn't really tell who was transsexual, because lots of transsexual people were left out of the equation or didn't fit into the equation, as one put it. Twin studies. Twin studies are easy. I've got twins. What they found was if you got male twins and female twins, if they were going to both transition to living as the opposite sex, more male twins would do that than female twins, and what seems much more sensible, more monozygotic twins did it. In other words, identical twins than dizygotic twins, non-identical twins did it. But they actually discovered the vast majority of twins, whether they were monozygotic or dizygotic, didn't both transition. Only one of them would do so, which completely confounds the idea that it has anything to do with biology, genetics, brains, even social upbringing and environment completely. When we look at brains or any other part of the body, and this idea of whether this is a delusion practiced upon people or an illusion making you deluded, which, you know, I like the idea of being a magician and doing that to everybody. The fact is, we know very little about this concept of gender. So why does any of this matter, you might think? Well, I think it really matters a lot. But if you look at these two concepts and see how important it is to be of the right race as well as being of the right gender, the contrast, the sameness is so similar that there are real issues. The fact is, being of the wrong race was an easily victimizable position. Being of the wrong gender, mostly being a girl in this world, means you can be victimized as less than human, other people control you, you're unpaid labor, often victims of violence and discrimination. That's why it matters, because somebody like Layla Acorn was made to undergo sessions of gay conversion therapy because she said she was a girl. And, you know, at the age of 16, saw herself in front of a car. It matters that 1,123 people were murdered in 5 years because they're identified as transgender or transsexual. That's a huge number when you compare it to any other particular grouping. So I asked Gender's Futures. Feminists have changed the world forever. They truly have changed the world forever. You know, as somebody who was born in the mid-1950s and was told my future was to go to secretarial college and then to marry an engineer and have 4 or 5 children, you know, the fact that I appeared to be of the wrong gender really mattered. And I didn't do this because I didn't want to go to secretarial college, however. Right. I did join the army hoping that they might give me a truck to drive or a police dog to handle, and instead they told me that I was going to be a telex operator in the intelligence corps, and I should be really pleased about that because they'd recognised that I could, you know, pass the tests well. If I'd wanted to be a bloody telex operator, I'd have gone to the secretarial college, for God's sake. Feminists have changed the world. The fact is, young men and young women are more likely to share the role of parent, homemaker and caregiver. They also expect to share their 2 incomes. No longer do I come home and say to my wife, there's £21, you can feed the children on that. You know, I used to once, of course. That was a joke. I just assume now the money goes into a bank account, I don't see it, you know, and several weeks later I say to Sarah, you know, I'm very pleased you've managed to feed us all and keep the bills paid for the last 4 weeks, and the next lot of wages are coming in. It will go into the same bank account, do the same things with it, and give me some pocket money occasionally. By changing the way men and women relate to each other and to work, the world has changed through the work primarily of feminists who have gone and said, hold on, we really need to rethink about what sex and gender means, and whether it does mean that certain people should be tied to the kitchen sink and be given, you know, the housekeeping each week, and whether other people should come home and smoke a pipe with their slippers put on, having had them warmed by the fire, which my father had, for example. You know, he came home and if his slippers weren't warmed, by God, you knew about it. I'd like to say, I imagine saying to my family, do you mind warming my slippers? They'd bloody well burn them. Feminists have changed the world. We are seeing a huge change now. We now reckon there are about 1 million plus transgender people, transgender identified people in the UK, 10 to 15,000 transsexual people living permanently in their new gender role. 4,000 of those have already obtained gender recognition certificates. That's the difference. When we were doing the Gender Recognition Act 10 years ago, we were saying there are 5,000 transsexual people in this country in total in those days. Huge numbers. A 5-fold increase in the number of people approaching clinical services for gender reassignment nowadays. 5-fold. We've had no increase in budget, I'd like to explain to you, over the last 10 years, but we've had a 5-fold increase in numbers. Look at the growth of young people. These are young people saying, I have a problem with my gender identity. And they go to the Portman Gender Identity Clinic. In 2010, 93 people. 2012, 165 children. 240 this year. Or, well, 2014, 240 children have gone to that clinic. And they still have had no increase in budget. Remember who to vote for. The Equality Act was partly to resolve this, provided all these sets of protections for trans people as well as other people in different groups of people who otherwise face discrimination, and was meant to provide a space in which, as a community, as a country, we could learn to live together with people of different ages, different abilities, different gender identities, different sexes, and different races and ethnicities. But I also think when we think about equality, one of the things that I think about is that often we don't theorise equality far enough. When we think about what we want for our young people, for our children in terms of equality, for ourselves in terms of equality, I think, first of all, equality has to be a personal sense of equality, that every child should be able to dream the dream, have the aspiration that they want to be an astronaut. Every child should then be able to go to school, and if they work hard, have the opportunity to apply to becoming an astronaut. And if they've done well enough, hopefully, they'll get to achieve and actually go off on a rocket one day. But we don't fundamentally provide that sense of aspirational equality to young people. I see it every day when I go, every time I go into a school you know, we have our little stall up there saying, study law at Manchester Metropolitan University. And all these parents walk by with their children and they put their arm and say, that's not for you, is it? And they head them off towards the army or the navy recruitment. And I run after them. And I pull these kids back and I say, it's not about genius, it's about hard work. You know? And every now and then one of them says, you stopped me once and you told me it was about hard work and about not being a genius. And I said, well, I'm a genius, so pay attention. But also there has to be a sense of public equality. There should be a sense of equality in terms of our personal status. Why do students from a university like my law school say, well, of course, I'm not going to apply for a city law firm? And I say, why not? And they say, well, it'll go to people from Oxbridge, won't it? And I say, well, it always will go to people from Oxbridge unless you bloody well apply for it. You know, why not somebody like you? We should also have equality for our sense of personal privacy and also relationship recognition, whatever forms those relationships take. But on top of that, there has to be a notion of cultural equality. And I put up this picture for Gemma Baker particularly. Gemma Baker was recently prosecuted and received a 3-year jail sentence for having consensual sex with another girl, both over the age of 16. Is that an offence? They both agreed to it, they both did it. Very nice, thank you. Is that an offence? No, of course it's not. Except that Gemma had dressed herself up as a boy, called herself Scott, and had sex with this girl thinking that she was having sex with a boy. Now, you think, well, that's a bit dodgy, isn't it? And mostly I want to take Gemma's hand and smack her hard and say, you know, not to do that sort of thing, because it'll get you into bloody trouble. I don't think it should, however. The fact is, if I go to somebody and they like me and we have consensual sex, and actually I've told them I'm a millionaire, the fact that I'm not a millionaire does not stop their consent being valid. If I told them, you know, that I was an astronaut, it doesn't stop their consent being valid. But if a 16-year-old says I'm a boy when actually they're born a girl, even though they say that they want gender reassignment, ultimately that becomes a criminal offence. That's why we have to think about gender. All of these different things have to fall in. Now, I put no racism at the top of this, and I'm going to finish. How did this proposition acquire the unarguably morally axiomatic status it now enjoys? Every school in this country goes, no racism, full stop. Absolutely, completely. It is an expellable offence to be racist in any school in this country. Well, first of all, we have a whole history of people saying, actually, guess what, racism is wrong. It's wrong, right? The radicals from the 1960s kept saying it was wrong. You know, Thatcher tried to say, well, perhaps it's okay, but she didn't have the moral wherewithal to really sort of push that. Consciousness raising about issues like the Holocaust made us quite clear in this country that white tribalism, as how one might call it, was a bad thing. It was articulated. Being articulated, it became compelling. It became something worth attaining. The liberal mass media, quite rightly, rammed it down our throats. No racism. Genderism, like racism, has no place in a civilized society because gender, like race, is nothing. It is nothing except a tool of control, a means of having power over other people. If gender was merely a place for personal expression, that would be absolutely fine. And we do believe nowadays it is morally axiomatic that we live in a diverse society where diversity should be celebrated and other people's cultures should be respected. We should have the equivalent for gender, and it is different from sex. It is so different because we have no idea what it really is, except that it controls people's lives and their well-beings. It means that girls become victims and boys become victims of all sorts of terrible things. So why not no genderism, just like no racism? We owe it to our children to do something different. Thank you.
Well, many thanks for a great story, a very compelling narrative, and a really passionate plea for why this is all so important. We have plenty of time for questions, so let's see some hands raised. We've got a roaming mic that will come to you. Perhaps you just say who you are.
I'm Katie, met earlier. I've just been reading David Valentine's work recently, and I was just wanting to know your opinion. There was an interesting quote where he believes that the unquestioned use of the term transgender actually can produce forms of class and racial hierarchies in itself, and I was just wondering what your opinions on that might be.
I think he was right. I think prior to the 1980s, I think the qualification of being transsexual or transgender, there was certain ways of being, and most of it was judged by how well you passed as a woman or a man, or how well you chose not to pass as a woman or a man. You know, that sort of the whole hierarchy of what sort of woman and what sort of man you are. I think the internet in the early 1980s really sort of knocked that on the head completely. It was the days when in the internet you couldn't see anybody, all you could see was their typing. And it was the most liberating thing possible for trans people, because we became just our typing. We became who we said we were. You know that old joke, nobody knows whether you're a dog on the internet. Well, you know, you could say, well, I'm a woman and people believed you, or I'm a man and people believed you, and they accepted it. And they took you at face value, and you were then able to explore those issues. And as a community, we were able to critically analyse the question of whether what we looked like mattered. Whether the aim of the clinics for us to become somehow a representative illusion of the opposite sex to such an extent that nobody could ever tell, and we should never tell anybody. We should disappear ourselves, in other words, as trans people, disappear ourselves completely into becoming normative men and women, I think was the most oppressive thing that ever happened to us. But the fact that we're able to go, you know, stick two fingers effectively up to the clinics and say, guess what, this is a unified voice, but we don't believe that any longer. And to that extent, I think I would agree that David had a point at one point, but you know, 10 years ago there was no such thing as a trans man in India. Now there are 10 trans men support groups in India. You know, the internet, the smartphone particularly, has changed the world. There are trans activists all over the world now. I remember talking to somebody, some minister from a government, you know, the Nigerian government, and he says, we don't have such people in our country. And I said, well, I think you do. He said, no, we don't have them in our country. And now, of course, they're having to legislate to try not to have them, and homosexual people and such like. You know, this deep, intense sort of, let's try and push it back and push it away. Well, you're not going to be able to. You know, the smartphone has brought us into your living rooms, and I think that's wonderful. Does that answer it?
Thank you. Hi, so, oh God.
Speak with a whisper.
Yeah, I'll be quiet. So I'm interested that your talk was called The Future of Gender, but like most of the discussion of like biomedical transition seems to be moving towards creating bodies that are similar to cis bodies, like cisgender bodies. So I'm interested, like, and I understand that part of that comes from like the NHS and like public funding of surgeries, but I'm interested in like what you think of concepts like an experimental transsexualities, of like bodies that don't try to replicate like or elevate or idolize cissexual you know, ways of existing, and how that fits into like, especially in the UK. I'm from the United States, where you can like bi or not bi, whatever, you know, like, whereas here it's like publicly funded.
Whatever form of plasticity you prefer.
Yeah, so I'm interested like how that fits into this, since like a lot of the discussion has been like towards binary identified people who have who desire body morphology, basically replicating like cissexual idealists.
So, you know, this whole sort of process in the NHS which says, you know, we're going to make you look as normal as possible in your new gender. Well, fortunately, being an older trans man, that was never an option. You know, my body was always going to be, look, it's okay, I've got a beard. But the minute I take my clothes off, ooh, a surprise, you know. And having to learn to live with that and really evaluate what that means in terms of my own sense of gender and my own sense of self. I'm very aware that the challenges that it has presented have been not easy, but probably beneficial in developing a more complex version and view of what people can be like. My concern now is that certainly here in the UK, oh, guess what, you can all go off, you can have a slice taken out of your arm, you can have a little sausage made, you know, and you can pee through it. Oh, no, you won't be able to have sex with it because to make it look authentic, it's not going to be big enough for you to be able to have any rods put into it so that you can erect it and have sexual intercourse. Oh, no, you can't do that, but you didn't ask for that. You asked for something so you could stand up and pee and look normal. And I'm going, why are you doing it on kids who can only have that conversation? You should be, you know, I talk to clinicians a lot, you should be saying to them, do you realise there are different possibilities here? And that, you know, you go for one option, you're going to miss out on the other option. Don't just, you know, it's not like a piece of factory furniture you can provide, you know, something from IKEA that you put together in the bedroom. It's more complex than that. It really concerns me that for trans men, they're having operations that I don't think they understand the complexity of, and they don't realise the limitations of. And it really bothers me that still trans women are having surgical operations where only 1 in 5 of them will be orgasmic at the end of it. Now, I say that and somebody will say, oh, I'm orgasmic. And I say, what do you mean by orgasm? Well, it's not the same as before. No, of course it's not the same as before because it's not orgasmic, you know. There's a difference, there's that whole process. But we delude ourselves as a community all the time. We lie to ourselves because we won't tell the truth about the limitations of what we've been through because we're ashamed. You know, we're ashamed always of being these different people. And the reason why we don't tell the truth about the limitations of the surgery we had is because if we did tell the truth, we know, if nothing else, our mother would say, well, what did you expect? You went ahead and did it. It's your own fault. You know, and that's exactly what they say. You know, I hear it many times from people's mothers. Well, you know, he had this operation, he's never been well since, you know, or he had this operation, he thought that if he had the operation he'd be able to get a girlfriend. Since when did an operation ever get anybody a girlfriend, you know? Huh? Going to a bar gets you a girlfriend. I sometimes feel like I just want to be a blunt speaker about these issues and take the community and speak bluntly to them about getting their heads together, understanding complexities and forgetting the dreams, because the dreams don't really exist. But that doesn't mean to say you can't have a really happy life on the way to the non-existent dream. Because lots of us do have that, and actually that's what most people do throughout their lives. They set off with lovely dreams of how their future's going to be, and they never quite make it, but they have a good time along the way. What's wrong with that? Thank you. Somebody's going, in the corner here. Good, thank you. And that's what the message that I think we need to be saying to young trans people. If you're going to try the new thing, yeah, experiment, but be aware that it's an experiment. If you're going to, you know, go for the traditional operation, that means you can't do X, Y, and Z. Just be aware of it and say, I've chosen to do that. That's my choice. And, you know, at some point later, you know, if you go, oh God, the problem is, I would really like to have an erection so I could have intercourse, well, then we'll talk about what's available from the shops to help you along the way. But it's being truthful with ourselves as a community. And that's why I will often say, you know, I don't have easy answers, but I do know there are a hell of a lot of difficult questions to deal with as we go through the pathway. We need to talk them. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. In other words, I think I do, you know, contemporary transsexualities myself, just by existing and by saying, you know, I refuse to pretend I had something done which I didn't have done, or I've got some magic sausage between my legs, or that I've got, you know, anything else. If it's not real, you know, let's be frank about it.
Hi, Stephen, thank you. Mark McCormack, academic here at Durham. Thank you for the talk. I thought it was really interesting the kind of comparison to race at the end, and in a sense race has been so successful as a political movement by buying into the identity politics and the essentialist position of race as inherent, as birth, as real, when we still know it's a social construction. And it seemed to me that there's a tension in like the trans movement in terms of an essentialist position of the biological reality showing that the binary system of gender doesn't work, yet at the same time trying to resist that biology and then argue against gender more broadly. And I wondered if you think that tension is there, to what extent you think it impacts on the politics, and yeah, well, those two things.
Well, I recognise that, you know, the identity politics and the buying into an essentialist framework of race has been essential in attacking racism, just as it has been with sexism. However, surely we are intelligent enough to acknowledge that that is what we are doing, and it is nothing more than being part of an intellectual fantasy in order to create a political position. Now, maybe that's a bit too advanced for the Labour Party nowadays, but the fact is that we have to take a position in the first place to challenge something. If I go around being wishy-washy about the fact that gender actually is perhaps not a very good thing for people, you know, because it causes an immense amount of harm, people go, oh, yes, yes. But if I say, actually, it's really bloody awful and bad, and it's morally unacceptable in a contemporary civilization that we define people's bodies as forming into, you know, not only sexes and ages and everything else, and I think that's all wrong, and, you know, the Equality Act tried to stop all that, but we also do it about gender, then, you know, it's unless you're absolutely clear and sort of dogmatic about the idea that it is wrong, it is only then that we're ever going to move away from a point that my children could go to school where there was a school with absolutely no racism, and they didn't notice the colour of the skin of their friends. Saying to the children, are you inviting so-and-so to your party? Who do you mean? You know, the black kid in your class. What? You know, the black kid in your class. There's nobody black in my class. Well, there is. There isn't anybody black in my class. Okay, they're darker skinned. You mean they've got a brown skin? Well, yes, I mean they've got a brown skin. Oh, right, yeah. Yes, I'm inviting him to the party. You know, you go, hold on a minute. That again, you know, this whole idea of they can do it to the point where they don't see colour any longer. I remember my wife explained to me years ago that having been brought up in Brighton, where it was very, very white, it never occurred to her that anybody practiced racism because nobody did there effectively. So when she moved up to Manchester, she couldn't believe the fact that people were behaving in a racist manner, because why would they? Because it wasn't something that normal people did, and you sort of tried to explain the complexities of urban inner city Manchester in the 1960s and 70s, you know, and the fight for jobs, and put all that big context around it. But that complexity has to be acknowledged. We have to buy into certain political positions in order to challenge and use what we've learned are really good political tools to create change. When we set up Press for Change in 1992, one of our biggest problems as a group of people who wanted to create a framework in which ordinary trans people could lead ordinary lives like everybody else was the fact that we didn't think it was all about birth certificates and marriage. And I remember a trans woman to this day saying to me, look at me, I'm 6'4". Even if I got a bloke to marry me, it wouldn't be exactly a very, you know, I'm not going to wear a white wedding dress or anything like that. You know, it's as far removed from a conventional idea of marriage. What I would really want to know is that if he died, I could get hold of his, you know, my share of his pension, or if I died, he could get hold of my, you know, his share of my pension. And so we were very challenged by that idea that what we were going to be doing was trying to have a campaign that actually pushed you more and more and more towards something which involved changing birth certificates and giving people the right to marry, which is what the Gender Recognition Act did in the end of the day. But of course the campaign was never really about that at all. What it was about was saying, here are some people who are different from everybody else, but they would like to be able to do the same things as everybody else, but within their differences. And that's really how we have to tackle the differences that are currently existing in this world, in a framework where we still see girls and boys going out facing all sorts of uncertainties, particularly the violence that young girls and boys face in day-to-day life, just because they happen to be girls or boys. And so we have to take, I suppose, a mature, complex approach to a question and recognise the reality of the framework that we're working in, as we did with the Gender Recognition Act. And even then with the Act, we argued to the bitter end over some aspects of it. People said, oh, they gave in on this, and they gave on, we didn't give in on anything. We argued to the point where, you know, it received royal assent over things, but we weren't prepared to let the whole thing drop over one of those argument points, because it meant that 95% of people weren't going to get a solution. We always knew we could never get something that would do 100% of people's problems. We could hit 95% of them. But that was by recognising how difficult it is to do real politics in the world today. And the really complex issues we have to do. And as I said with gender, we don't know what the hell it is. So how can we do politics around it? Well, we can still do politics around it and try and make it different. Does that sort of answer it?
Hi, I'm Savi. I was just wondering, you were talking a lot about gender identity and having the wrong identity, but being female but you feel male, or being male but you feel female. I was just wondering, Facebook has added like 51 different gender identities that you could identify as, and so with such a wide range of genders that aren't just male or female, what do you think that means for the future of gender?
Well, that's partly the whole point of it, isn't it? If gender becomes one of 51 different things, does it have any real meaning at all? And, you know, that's the key thing, I suppose, is that, you know, I feel that gender is something that in a modern civilized society causes so many problems. We need to somehow ditch it and take 51 different options. I could have talked about lots of different things here. You know, there are cultures which have more than 2 genders. There are Eskimo cultures which have 9 genders. And if they can manage to live with 9 genders, and Facebook can manage to live with 51 genders, and I actually went through that list and added about 6 to it, because we were part of the consultation on the Facebook gender things. And the woman at Facebook said, "You've managed to find 6 new ones." And I said, yes, why not? If you can have 45, why is another 6 anything strange about it? And she was going, I just don't know how you managed to find 6 new ones, and they're valid, she said. When I read it, I realised, yes, we should have put those in there. And I said, I could have probably added another 6 and another 6 if I'd really want to do it. Often when I talk to groups like this, if you're an older group of people, I often look at the women very carefully, and then at some point in the presentation I take the women, now you, and I pick 2 women with completely contrasting versions of what it is to be a woman, and I say, how would you feel, you know, obviously if they were your own clothes, but I asked you to change clothes. You know, you actually wore clothes like hers and you wore clothes like hers. How would you feel about it? And they go, ooh, ooh, that's not me. And I say, what's that? What's the not me bit there? What's the not me bit that you're suddenly, you know, talking about when you say not me? And after a little bit of discussion, we boil down to the fact that it's not the right gender presentation of womanhood that they feel comfortable with. In other words, it's a different gender. So we picked up 2 women in a room and we found 2 women with 2 different women genders. Men tend to be a bit more boring about their clothing. Why we're not more exciting is beyond me. But women, I can see a group of women in the room, and there are clearly often 7 to 9 genders that I can point out quite clearly. Oh, well, they're this sort, and they're that sort, and there's this sort, you know, and she's the one who irons her hair. My wife says it's not called ironing your hair, but I can't get it quite right what it is that makes your hair very straight. Lots of my students do it. They, you know, come in and their hair's perfectly straight. If it's not ironing, what is it? Straightening. Thank you. They iron their hair and straighten it. But you can point to them and you can go, look, this is different ways of being a woman. Surely you can see that they're not all the same. And in fact, for each one of you who is choosing one of these options to portray yourself, that's the one you feel comfortable with. The other one wouldn't. And actually, it will impact upon who you attract when you go out. You know, looking for a date, it will impact on, you know, how your children feel about what being a girl and a boy is when they grow up, the portrayal of yourself as a woman. So, in many ways, it sort of fulfills the argument. You know, Facebook said to me, somebody said to me, are you going to pick your new gender on Facebook? And I said, oh my God, I read the list, surely that was enough. Now, don't ask me to pick one for myself. Because why should I want to pick one, and why shouldn't I be able to explore the full range of gendered options within a framework that fits me?
So why not a blank box then?
What about the blank box?
Yeah,
well, I think absolutely why not a blank box? There is nothing legally that ever nowadays puts us in a position where we need to know what. We rarely need to know what sex anybody is. We certainly never need to know what gender anybody is in law. And yet, we insist on people saying whether they're men or women, or whether they're male or female. You know, we don't need to know it. And I remember the absolute fury I felt as a law student when I was, I'd once been stopped by the police because my brake light was out, and I was asked to show my driving licence, but my driving licence had been stolen and had been reported to the police a week earlier, but the civil service were on strike, so I couldn't get a new driving licence, but I was apparently allowed to drive the car because I was legally able to drive. But the fact that I couldn't present the stolen driving licence to the police meant that I got a £5 fine for a brake light being out. And I remember the utter fury at the sheer sort of machinations of this Kafkaesque situation existing. And then the police, about 2 days later, arrived at my house and said they'd had it in the police station for the last month. And I thought, do I go and ask for my £5 back now for the fine? But that's a bit how it feels like. And one of the first things I realised when doing law was something to do with the Road Traffic Act. The Road Traffic Act meant, the 1984 Road Traffic Act meant, not only if you committed an offence did you have to tell the police your name and address and show a licence, you also had to tell them your sex. And I was legally female, but if I went to the police station and said, I'm Stephen Whittle, but I'm legally female, you know, and here's my driving licence. Can you imagine the confusion and the Kafkaesque situation that they were going to be in at that point? And that sort of, you know, the law, thankfully, has moved on considerably. We don't need these things. We need to make sure gender really is, for our children, about their expression and freedom of expression, and not about something that's going to control them.
Any last questions?
You're the last.
Hi, I'm Lee. You've talked a couple of times in your answers about the community and talking bluntly to the community. And I wanted to ask, you've talked so much about gender becoming meaningless. What about the category of trans, where you've got so many different generations of trans people who've gone through different routes, come to different understandings of what being trans means for them? You've got older transitioners, younger transitioners, many, many more children presenting. You've got genderqueer people, agender people. Do you see a future fragmentation in the category of trans, and what does that mean for organisations like Press for Change?
No, I just think that more and more people can be trans. Most people could choose to be trans in some way, shape or form if they were prepared to explore what it means to be gendered for themselves. You know, and I think most people, if you say, you know, actually, if as a woman, being a woman means you can't do this and this, but if you counted yourself as trans, you could do that and that, would you count yourself as trans? And they go, oh yes, because, you know, it's a bit almost like Tampax. If I could buy Tampax, I could ride a bicycle finally. Well, you know, if I could take the label trans, maybe I could, you know, become a fire person instead of being a woman who stays at home thinking I've got to be a certain sort of woman. Why can't the girls who, as I call it, iron their hair, choose to become firewomen? Because they don't think they could possibly become firewomen, because feminine girls don't become fire people. And yet, there is absolutely no reason at all why they shouldn't, except the control that they have over themselves, over what sort of girls they are. I don't care whether trans really exists or not. I don't care whether we have any of these labels in the end. But I really, you know, I would hope that we stop existing because we become like them, except that some of us choose to go and have whatever it is we choose to have done to ourselves. I mean, there's masses of people having plastic surgery in this country. They don't have to see psychiatrists. They don't have to see counsellors to do it. You know, they just go over and hand over a cheque. And they, you know, if they're lucky, they get to see a counsellor for half an hour who says, have you thought about this carefully? And they say, yeah, here's the cheque. And they go off and have all sorts of things done to their body. And yet, because I say I'm trans, I can't have things done to my body without having 2 psychiatrists sign me off. It's insane. And that doesn't mean to say, however, that things like the real life experience shouldn't exist, because I actually think the people who are going and just writing their cheques and seeing a counsellor for half an hour before having their boobs uplifted should perhaps be sent away to live for a year without their boobs being uplifted and realise whether they really want to have their boobs uplifted, because it's a hell of a, you know, complex thing to do and a big risk to take with future body sort of well-being, to go and have implants in at the age of 15 like girls are doing. So, you know, it's that sort of thing. There's one thing about stopping and thinking. There's another thing about having gatekeepers. And actually, if it's done properly, those people there shouldn't be gatekeepers. They should be facilitators. But facilitators who make you stop. You know, students arrive at university and they hand over the cheque and we don't give them a degree certificate. You know, much as though they don't like it, I stand there in between as a facilitator to make sure that when they get that degree certificate, they feel they've really achieved something. Because if they just hang it over the cheque and get given the degree certificate, it's meaningless. So it's that whole difference, isn't it, between do we take a mature and adult approach to what we do to our bodies, which is, of course, you're entitled to do anything you want to in your body, but you need to think about what the extent is of doing it. Every operation anybody undergoes has risks and has dangers to it. And the fact that 15-year-olds can go and now buy breast implants and can go and see the person one day and go in the next day is really bad medicine in my view. You know, and they call themselves doctors, the people who do it. So presumably they're meant to be looking after our well-being. So, you know, let's try some well-beingness.
Well, before I thank you, Stephen, for a fantastic evening, not just a wonderful lecture, I'd just like to make 2 announcements that are about the next 2 lectures. We have pretty rapidly after Stephen's lecture, on the 29th of April next week, Caroline Duffy speaking, the Poet Laureate, She has written numerous books, and she will sign books after her presentation. So I should point out this is a ticketed event. The tickets are largely sold, not sold, but given away, allocated as it were. But there's always a chance that some people don't come who hold tickets. So if you're very keen to come to listen to her poetry readings and presentation, come anyway, and we'll see if we can squeeze you in. And then on the 6th of May, it's Professor Tom Weiss from the US who will talk about humanitarianism and the impact and pursuit of humanitarianism in global politics, a very different kind of lecture. And then that will be the end of this year's series. We are already planning next year's series, which will start with Bishop Lilly on the 28th of October, but I don't have to tell you about that now. So in the meantime, I want to wish you all a fantastic evening, the rest of it, but particularly thank you, Stephen, for, this is not a field that I've thought about a great deal, I have to say. So for me, it's been extremely illuminating and engaging. And it fits with a lot of things I do conceptually in political philosophy, but you come at them in a very different sort of way. So I want to thank you, and I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Stephen for a great evening.